Tonight, we're going to gently peel back the layers of romantic legend and step into the quieter, often unglamorous, reality of the medieval night. Forget the shining armor and the grand feasts depicted in story. Instead, imagine the rustle of coarse wool, the scent of wood, and the surprisingly simple flavors that would have graced their We're going to explore a topic that might, at first, seem rather mundane, but it offers a fascinating glimpse into the everyday lives of these iconic figures. Their surprisingly bland diets. So, let your mind drift, picture a dimly lit hall, and allow the quiet truths of medieval sustenance to lull you into a peaceful slumber. When you think of a medieval knight, what images come to mind? Perhaps it's a valiant figure, astride a powerful warhorse, clad in gleaming steel, charging into battle with a mighty sword. You might imagine grand castles, noble ladies, and, when it comes to food, overflowing banqueting tables laden with roasted meats, exotic spices, and flowing goblets of wine. This is the enduring, romanticized vision, one heavily influenced by chivalric romances and later Victorian interpretations of the Middle Ages. It's a vision that's very appealing, almost dreamlike in its grandeur. But like many romantic ideals, this picture often glosses over the gritty, practical realities of daily life in the medieval period, particularly when it came to something as fundamental as food. The image of the perpetually feasting knight, indulging in a rich and varied diet, is largely a myth, especially for the vast majority of knights who were not kings or dukes, but rather landowners of modest means, or even landless soldiers in service to a lord. The Middle Ages, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a time profoundly different from our own. Life was agrarian, technology was rudimentary, and the rhythm of existence was dictated by the seasons, the whims of nature, and the ever-present threat of famine, disease, and conflict. Food scarcity was a constant shadow, and the ability to simply survive, to put enough food on the table to sustain oneself and one's household, was a daily triumph. Imagine the quiet anxiety that would have accompanied the harvest, the dependence on favorable weather, and the knowledge that a bad season could mean true hardship. For the knight, despite his noble status, his diet was fundamentally shaped by these broader realities. While he certainly ate better than the peasants who toiled on his lands, his meals were far from the continuous lavish spreads often depicted. His life was one of duty, training, and often hardship. He spent long hours in military exercises, maintaining his armor, and managing his estate. Sustenance was primarily about fuel for a demanding life, not necessarily about culinary delight. The concept of bland in this context isn't necessarily a judgment on their culinary skill, but a reflection of limited access to a wide range of ingredients, especially spices and preservation techniques. The flavors were often earthy, hearty, and repetitive, focusing on what was readily available, seasonal, and could be stored. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of a warm, filling meal, even if its flavors were simple and familiar, knowing it provided the energy needed for the next day's duties. So, as we embark on this quiet exploration, let go of the images of extravagant feasts and gilded platters. Instead, settle into the quiet reality of a medieval castle's kitchen, smelling the faint aroma of boiling pottage and roasting game, and consider the practicalities of a knight's stable. We'll discover that their meals, though perhaps lacking the exotic flair we associate with royalty, were robust, functional, and deeply reflective of the world they inhabited. It's a story of survival, practicality, and the quiet rhythm of sustenance in a time long past. Let's now gently contrast the romanticized image of the medieval knight with the often stark and practical realities of daily life in the Middle Ages, which profoundly dictated what ended up on their plates. Imagine a world where existence was largely where daily routines were dictated by the sun and the seasons, and where the concept of abundance, as we know it, was almost entirely foreign. This underlying reality of medieval life is key to understanding the surprisingly simple and often bland diets of even those in noble positions. The medieval period was characterized by a fundamental reliance on agriculture. The vast majority of the population lived in rural areas, directly tied to the land. Food production was labor-intensive and unpredictable. Imagine the sheer effort involved in plowing fields with oxen, hand-sowing seeds, and harvesting crops with basic tools. There were no large-scale industrial farms, no refrigerated transport, and no global supply chains to ensure a consistent, varied food supply. Each region largely depended on what it could grow or raise locally. This dependence on local, seasonal produce meant that diets were inherently repetitive and limited by geographies and climate. Imagine eating the same handful of grains and vegetables day in and day out, with fresh produce available only for short periods after harvest. The concept of year-round access to a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, so commonplace today, was simply unimaginable. Most produce was consumed fresh when available, or preserved through methods like pickling, drying, or salting, which often altered their flavor profile considerably. Beyond the challenges of production, the medieval world was plagued by constant threats to food security. Imagine the anxiety that would accompany a particularly harsh winter, a prolonged drought, or an unexpected flood, each capable of wiping out entire harvests. Famine was a recurring specter, always lurking just beyond the horizon. Even minor crop failures could lead to widespread hunger and malnutrition among the general populace, while knights, as part of the ruling class, were somewhat insulated from the worst effects of famine. Their access to abundant and varied food was still fundamentally constrained by the overall productivity and vulnerability of the land. Warfare, too, was a constant feature of the medieval landscape, disrupting trade routes and leading to periods of scarcity. Imagine the impact of invading armies sweeping through a region, burning crops and seizing livestock. Even for a knight, his ability to sustain himself and his household was directly tied to the security and productivity of his domain. Disease was another significant factor. Poor sanitation and a lack of medical understanding meant that illnesses could spread rapidly, impacting the workforce and, by extension, food production. Imagine the quiet despair of a community ravaged by plague, further diminishing their capacity to grow and prepare food. Given these fundamental challenges, the primary goal of medieval eating, even for a knight, was simply sustenance. Food was fuel. It needed to provide enough calories and nutrients to perform demanding physical labor, whether that was plowing a field for a peasant or training in heavy armor for a knight. The idea of food as a source of diverse flavors, culinary artistry, or a continuous parade of new dishes was largely secondary. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of a full stomach, knowing that you had enough energy for the day's duties, even if the meal itself was The flavors of medieval food were, by modern standards, often bland or monotonous. While we'll discuss spices later, access to them was limited to the very wealthy. The vast majority of meals relied on simple preparations, boiling, roasting over an open fire, or slow cooking in a pot. Sauces and complex flavorings were rare, and freshness was not always guaranteed due to limited preservation techniques. Imagine a diet largely composed of boiled grains, stews, and roasted meats seasoned primarily with salt, and perhaps a few local herbs. So, when we delve into the specifics of a medieval knight's diet, it's crucial to hold this broader reality in mind. Their food choices were a direct reflection of environmental constraints, economic realities, and the ever-present struggle for survival. The romantic vision of endless feasting gives way to a more nuanced picture of hearty, functional, and often repetitive meals, designed to sustain life in a challenging and unpredictable world. This quiet truth helps us to better understand the practicalities that governed what landed on a knight's table. Let's now consider how the very structure of medieval society, the intricate feudal system, exerted a profound influence on what medieval knights ate, and indeed, on the distribution of food throughout the social hierarchy. Imagine a vast, interconnected web of obligations and alliances, where land, labor, and sustenance flowed upwards and downwards, profoundly shaping the diets of everyone from the lowest serf to the most powerful lord. This system, far from offering culinary freedom, dictated access to food as a fundamental expression of power and status. At the base of the feudal pyramid were the peasants, or serfs, who toiled on the land. They technically owned nothing, but were tied to the land and obligated to provide labor, produce, and taxes to their lord. In return, they received protection and, crucially, access to a plot of land to grow their own food. Their diet was overwhelmingly agrarian, dominated by grains they cultivated themselves, supplemented by vegetables they grew, and very rarely, any meat. Imagine their daily existence, characterized by endless toil in the fields, with their diet directly reflecting the fruits of their arduous labor. Above the peasants were the knights, often lesser nobility or vassals who held land from a more powerful lord in exchange for military service. This land would include agricultural fields, forests, and sometimes even a small village. The knight, therefore, consumed the produce of his own lands, either grown directly by his household or, more commonly, as a portion of the crops and livestock paid to him by his serfs as rent or tribute. Imagine the knight receiving sacks of grain, bundles of vegetables, and perhaps a few animals from his tenants, forming the core of his household's larder. The feudal system meant that a knight's diet, while superior to that of a peasant, was still fundamentally localized. His food sources were primarily what could be produced within his domain, or what could be readily obtained from immediate neighbors through limited trade or barter. There was no vast, centralized food distribution network. Imagine the challenge of acquiring diverse foods when transportation was difficult, and surpluses were often small and seasonal. Access to certain types of food was a direct indicator of one's place in the feudal hierarchy. Meat, for instance, was a significant status symbol. While peasants might occasionally catch small game or have a pig at slaughtering time, regular meat consumption was largely reserved for the nobility. The forests and hunting grounds, often rich in deer, boar, and other game, were typically considered the exclusive domain of the lord, with poaching strictly forbidden and severely punished. Imagine the symbolic power of a freshly roasted boar on a knight's table, a visible sign of his noble right to hunt and consume the spoils of the land. The lord at the top of the pyramid, the king, or a powerful duke, commanded vast estates and received tribute from numerous vassals, including many knights. This centralized control over immense resources allowed the most powerful nobles to maintain larger households, employ more cooks, and acquire a greater variety of food, including imported luxuries like exotic spices. Their banquets, though still less lavish than often portrayed, would certainly have been grander than those of a modest knight. Imagine the king's larder, brimming with produce from across his lands, enabling a degree of culinary choice unthinkable for his vassals. Religious dietary laws also played a significant role within the feudal structure. The church, a powerful institution throughout the Middle Ages, mandated periods of fasting and abstinence from meat, particularly during Lent and on Fridays. During these fish days, even the most powerful lords and knights would adhere to these rules, replacing meat with fish, dairy, and eggs. This meant a substantial portion of the year saw a shift in diet for everyone, regardless of their position in the feudal system. Imagine the quiet adherence to these religious dictates, shaping the menu for days at a time. The feudal system, therefore, profoundly influenced the diets of medieval knights by localizing food sources. Meals were primarily based on what could be grown or raised on their own lands or nearby, making food a status symbol. Access to certain foods, especially meat and imported goods, directly reflected one's position in the hierarchy, dictating availability. Food supply was vulnerable to agricultural success, local conflicts, and natural disasters, enforcing religious restrictions. The church's dietary rules applied across all social strata. So, when we envision a medieval knight's diet, it's not just about what they liked to eat, but fundamentally about what the feudal system allowed them to eat. Their meals were a tangible manifestation of their place in society, often surprisingly simple and repetitive, a far cry from the endless bounty of romantic taste. This quiet truth helps us appreciate the daily reality of sustenance for these iconic figures. Now that we've grasped the societal structures influencing the medieval diet, let's settle into the quiet, pervasive truth of a knight's table, the overwhelming dominance of grain and bread. Imagine a meal in a medieval hall, and inevitably, the centerpiece of every plate, every trench, would have been some form of grain. This wasn't merely a component of their diet, it was their diet, providing the vast majority of their calories and forming the bedrock of sustenance for all social classes, including the knight. Cereals were the absolute staple of medieval life. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats were cultivated across Europe, each suited to different climates and soil types. For a knight, particularly in Western Europe, wheat was the most prized grain. It was used to make the finest bread, considered a mark of status. Imagine the comforting yeasty aroma of freshly baked wheat bread, perhaps still warm from the oven, served at the knight's table. This bread wasn't the light, airy loaf we often think of today. It was dense, dark, and hearty, made from whole grains, providing substantial caloric and nutritional value. It was often baked daily or every few days in large, communal ovens or the castle's own bakehouse. Bread itself was consumed in astonishing quantities. It served not only as food, but also as a utensil. Imagine a thick slice of stale bread, called a trencher, used as a plate. Food would be piled on top of it, absorbing the juices and flavors of the meal. At the end of the meal, the trencher, now soggy and flavorful, would either be eaten by the diner or, more commonly, given to the servants or distributed to the poor. This practice highlights the frugality and efficiency of medieval households, wasting nothing edible. While wheat was preferred, rye was also very common, especially in northern regions, producing a darker, denser bread. Barley and oats were often used for porridges, gruels, or coarser breads, particularly for servants and lower classes. But a knight's household might consume them as well, especially for breakfast or as a filler in stews. Imagine a thick, warm bowl of oat or barley pottage, simply seasoned, providing a comforting and filling start to a cold medieval day. The consumption of grains wasn't limited to bread. Pottage was a ubiquitous dish, a thick, slow-cooked stew or porridge made from grains, often mixed with whatever vegetables, legumes, or small scraps of meat were available. Imagine a large cauldron simmering over a fire for hours. Its contents a constantly evolving medley of ingredients. A knight's pottage would likely have been richer, with more substantial additions, but the fundamental base of boiled grains remained. This was a highly efficient way to stretch ingredients and provide a warm, easily digestible meal. Grains were also used in various forms of pastries, pies, and tarts, though these were more elaborate and less common daily fare. Meat or fruit might be encased in thick pastry crusts, which served as both cooking vessel and a way to preserve the contents. Imagine a robust meat pie, its crust a sturdy barrier, keeping the contents fresh for longer. The preparation of grains was Imagine the endless process of threshing the harvested grain, winnowing it to separate the chaff, and then grinding it into flour using heavy millstones. Access to a mill, often owned by the lord, was crucial for producing flour. This reliance on manual labor and basic technology meant that every loaf of bread, every bowl of pottage, represented a significant investment of time and effort. The flavor profile of a grain-heavy diet, by modern standards, could be considered bland and monotonous, while salt was readily available and used, and some local herbs might be incorporated. The complex layering of flavors from diverse spices was largely absent for most knights. Their meals were about sustenance and bulk. Imagine the earthy, yeasty taste of dense bread, the mildness of boiled grains, providing energy rather than a burst of distinct flavors. This reliance on grains also had significant nutritional implications. While providing ample carbohydrates and fiber, a diet overwhelmingly dominated by a single food group could lead to deficiencies if not carefully balanced. However, for the medieval knight, grains were the reliable foundation, the consistent source of calories in a world where food security was a daily concern. So, when you picture a medieval knight's meal, let the image of a robust, dark loaf of bread take center stage. It was the staff of life, the silent workhorse of their diet, providing the energy needed for training, warfare, and the management of their land. It was a humble, yet absolutely vital, component of their sustenance, underpinning every aspect of their surprisingly simple culinary world. From the ubiquitous presence of grain, let us now gently shift our gaze to the quieter, yet equally essential companions on a medieval knight's plate: vegetables and legumes. Imagine a world where fresh produce was a seasonal luxury, and the garden, rather than the supermarket, was the primary source of greens. The variety available was surprisingly limited by modern standards, and their preparation often leaned towards the simple and functional, designed for sustenance and digestibility rather than complex flavor. For the medieval knight, and indeed for most people in the Middle Ages, vegetables were a fundamental part of the diet, providing much-needed vitamins, minerals, and fiber that grains alone could not offer. These were typically grown in kitchen gardens within the castle grounds, or on the surrounding manorial lands. Imagine the quiet rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting these vital crops, a consistent cycle dictated by the seasons. The most common vegetables were hardy, easy to grow, and could be stored for at least some period. Think of cabbages, a ubiquitous staple, often eaten boiled or used in stew. Onions, leeks, and garlic were also incredibly common, used both for flavoring and for their perceived medicinal properties. Imagine the pungent aroma of onions simmering in a pottage, adding a much-needed depth of flavor to an otherwise simple dish. Root vegetables, like carrots, parsnips, and turnips were also important, especially as they could be stored in cool cellars through the winter months. Imagine the earthy sweetness of a roasted turnip, a welcome addition when fresh greens were scarce. However, it's important to note that medieval carrots were typically white or purple, not the vibrant orange we are familiar with today. Other common vegetables included peas and beans, which fall into the category of legumes. These were particularly valuable for their protein content, especially on fast days when meat was forbidden. Peas were often eaten fresh in season, or dried for winter consumption, and added to beans, like fava beans or broad beans, were also a dietary cornerstone, providing bulk and nutrition. Imagine a thick, hearty bean and vegetable stew, providing a comforting and filling meal on a cold evening. Potatoes and tomatoes, surprisingly, were entirely absent from the medieval European diet. These staple vegetables in our modern world were indigenous to the Americas and would only arrive in Europe centuries later. After the age of exploration, imagine a medieval kitchen without the familiar sight of a potato, relying instead on other root vegetables. The preparation of vegetables was, by and large, simple and practical. Most vegetables were either boiled, stewed, or pottage, again, served as a primary vehicle for vegetables and legumes. Imagine a large cauldron continuously simmering, with various vegetables and pulses thrown in to create a thick, nourishing stew. This method of slow cooking made the vegetables digestible and allowed their nutrients to be incorporated into a communal meal. Fresh salads, as we understand them, were less common, especially for ordinary meals. When fresh greens were available in season, they might be eaten, but the concept of raw vegetable consumption for everyday meals was not as prevalent due to concerns about cleanliness and digestibility. Imagine salads as a rare, delicate treat rather than a daily staple. Flavorings for vegetables were typically limited to salt and perhaps locally grown herbs like parsley, sage, thyme, or rosemary, if available. The exotic spices that we associate with luxury were far too expensive for daily use, even for most nights. This meant that the natural flavors of the vegetables themselves, often enhanced by long simmering, dominated the palate. Imagine the earthy, wholesome taste of slow-cooked cabbage and carrots, seasoned simply. The seasonal nature of vegetables meant periods of relative abundance followed by periods of scarcity. During the growing season, a night's table might see a wider variety of greens, but through the long winter months, the diet would rely heavily on dried legumes, preserved root vegetables, and stored grains. Imagine the relief and subtle joy when the first fresh vegetables of spring became available after a long, monotonous winter. So, while the image of a night often focuses on grand feasts, the quiet truth of their daily diet reveals a humble reliance on readily available and easily stored vegetables and legumes. These vital components provided essential nutrients and bulk, ensuring sustenance in a world where variety was a luxury and practicality was paramount. Their meals, based on these simple ingredients, formed a fundamental part of their surprisingly bland but ultimately functional diet. Moving from the everyday simplicity of grains and garden vegetables, let's now consider the more aspirational, and certainly more flavorful, component of a medieval night's diet: meat consumption. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of a night carving into a joint of roasted game, a distinct privilege that set him apart from the vast majority of the population. While meat was indeed a status symbol, its types and methods of preservation were often far from the continuous bounty we might envision, contributing to a broader diet that was still, in many ways, surprisingly bland. For the medieval knight, meat was a crucial part of his diet, providing essential protein and a sense of luxury. However, it's vital to understand that regular meat consumption was a marker of nobility and wealth. The common peasant ate meat rarely, perhaps only a pig slaughtered once a year, or small birds and rabbits caught stealthily. A knight, by virtue of his land ownership and feudal rights, had far greater access to animal protein, though it was still subject to availability and the dictates of the seasons and religious observances. The types of meat consumed varied. Pork was incredibly popular. Pigs were relatively easy to raise and fatten, and almost every part of the animal could be used, from chops and hams to sausages and bacon. Imagine the rich, savory smell of roasting pork, a comforting aroma in a medieval kitchen. Beef was also consumed, though cattle were often more valuable as draft animals for plowing fields. So beef might be reserved for more special occasions, or for larger noble households. Poultry was common, with chickens, geese, and ducks being relatively easy to keep. Imagine the clucking of chickens in the castle yard, providing a steady supply of both meat and eggs. These smaller birds would have been a regular feature on a knight's table. Perhaps the most iconic type of meat for the nobility was game. Forests and hunting grounds were often reserved for the lord, and hunting was not just a sport, but a noble pastime and a source of high-status food. Deer, wild boar, rabbits, and various game birds like pheasants and partridges would have graced the knight's table after a successful hunt. Imagine the quiet thrill of the chase, culminating in a feast of freshly caught game. However, hunting was not a daily activity, so game meat would have been intermittent. The biggest challenge with meat, as with other foods, was preservation. Without refrigeration, fresh meat spoiled quickly. This meant that much of the meat consumed, especially outside of immediate slaughter, had to be preserved. Salting was the most common and effective method. Imagine large barrels filled with layers of meat and salt, drawing out moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. This resulted in heavily salted meat, which required soaking before cooking to make it palatable. While effective, it imparted a very distinct, often strong, salty flavor that dominated the dish, contributing to a certain blandness in terms of varied taste profiles. Smoking was another method, particularly for pork products like hams and bacon. Imagine meat hanging in a smokehouse, slowly acquiring a smoky flavor and a protective coating. Drying was also used, especially for smaller cuts of fish, leveraging dry air to remove moisture. These preservation techniques, while essential for food security, significantly altered the taste and texture of the meat. Imagine a piece of heavily salted beef, its original flavor muted by the curing process. Even after soaking and boiling, this meant that the fresh taste of meat, as we understand it, was a rare luxury. Cooking methods were relatively simple. Meat would be roasted over an open fire on a spit, boiled in large cauldrons for stews and pottages, or sometimes baked in pies. Complex sauces and elaborate marinades were not common for daily meals, due to limited access to a wide range of spices and fresh herbs. Seasoning was primarily salt, and perhaps some local herbs like parsley or sage. But the intense flavors we associate with medieval banquets were largely reserved for very special occasions and the highest nobility. Religious fast days also heavily impacted meat consumption. For significant portions of the year, all of Lent, every Friday, and often Wednesdays and Saturdays, meat was forbidden by the church. This meant that knights, like everyone else, would have periods where their diet shifted away from meat entirely, relying instead on fish, dairy, and legumes. Imagine the quiet adherence to these long stretches of meat-free eating, further shaping the overall blandness of the yearly diet. So, while the image of a knight often conjures thoughts of hearty meat-filled feasts, the reality was more nuanced. Meat was certainly a privilege, a symbol of status, but its consumption was often dictated by availability, seasonality, and the limitations of preservation. The resulting diet, heavily reliant on salted or smoked meats with simple seasonings, contributed to an overall palate that was, by our modern standards, surprisingly functional and often quite bland. It was a diet designed for sustenance and status, reflecting the practicalities of medieval life. Having explored the role of meat, let's now turn our attention to an equally crucial, though perhaps less celebrated, component of the medieval knight's diet: fish. Imagine a medieval calendar, heavily marked with days of abstinence, where meat was forbidden, and fish became the primary source of protein. Far from being a mere alternative, fish was a staple, deeply integrated into the dietary rhythms of the Middle Ages, especially due to powerful religious injunctions. The medieval church held immense sway over daily life, and its dietary regulations were strictly observed, even by the nobility and knights. For a significant portion of the year, roughly 1/3 to nearly half, meat was forbidden. This included every Friday, the entire 40 days of Lent, Advent, and other numerous fast days and vigils throughout the year. On these days, known as fish days, all forms of meat from warm-blooded animals were prohibited. Imagine the quiet adherence to these rules, shaping the menus across every household, from the humblest cottage to the grandest castle. This meant that fish, along with eggs and dairy, became incredibly important. For coastal communities and those living near major rivers or lakes, fresh fish was a relatively accessible commodity. Imagine the daily catch being brought in, glistening and ready for the pot. Varieties like cod, herring, salmon, pike, and eels were common, depending on the region. However, for inland castles and households not directly on a major waterway, fresh fish was a luxury. To overcome this, medieval people relied heavily on preserved fish. Salted fish was perhaps the most common method. Imagine large quantities of cod or herring, caught in the North Sea or Atlantic, being heavily salted and dried. This resulted in a very strong, briny product that needed extensive soaking, sometimes 4 days. before it could be cooked and eaten. While effective for preservation, it imparted a very distinct salty taste that often overpowered other flavors. Smoked fish was another popular preservation technique, particularly for Imagine fish hanging in smokehouses, slowly acquiring a rich, smoky flavor and extended shelf life. Dried fish, especially in colder climates, was also prevalent. Stockfish, for example, made from air-dried cod or other white fish, became incredibly hard and required pounding and long soaking before consumption. Imagine the tough, almost leathery texture of dried fish before it was rehydrated and cooked into a dish. These preservation methods, while vital for ensuring a year-round supply of protein on fast days, often resulted in fish that was, by modern standards, quite bland in its original flavor, or overwhelmingly salty. Smoky, the subtle nuances of fresh fish were largely lost in the process. Cooking methods for fish were generally simple. It was frequently boiled, poached, or stewed in. Imagine a large cauldron of boiling water into which chunks of rehydrated salted fish were dropped, often alongside vegetables and grains. Frying, while known, would have been less common for large quantities due to the cost of cooking fats. For special occasions, fish might be roasted or baked in pies, fornights, and other nobility. Even on fast days, meals would still strive for some degree of abundance. While fresh fish was prized, their tables would have been well stocked with various preserved fish preparations. Imagine a platter of heavily salted cod alongside a smoked herring, perhaps with some fresh pike if the castle had access to a pond or river. The consumption of fish also extended to freshwater varieties. Many castles and monasteries maintained fish ponds, specifically for raising fish to ensure a reliable supply for fast days. Imagine the calm, reflective surface of a castle fit, a vital source of protein maintained specifically for dietary adherence. This pervasive reliance on fish, particularly preserved varieties, on fish days meant that the night's diet, for a significant portion of the year, lacked the richness of meat and relied on different, often more monotonous, flavor profiles. It highlights how religious belief fundamentally shaped the practicalities of medieval eating, ensuring a constant rotation between meat-based and fish-based sustenance. The quiet adherence to these dietary rhythms further cemented the overall and often bland nature of their daily meals. From the salty depths of fish days, let us now gently ascend to another vital, yet often overlooked, category of sustenance in the medieval knight's diet: dairy and eggs. Imagine a landscape dotted with grazing animals, and the ubiquitous presence of chickens scratching in the farmyard. Milk, cheese, butter, and eggs were fundamental components of medieval eating, providing essential fats, proteins, and calories, especially during periods when meat was forbidden, or for the majority of the population who rarely consumed it. Milk, primarily from cows, but also from goats and sheep, was a daily reality for medieval households. However, fresh milk, unpasteurized and imagine the quiet daily task of milking the animals and the immediate need to consume or process the milk before it soured. For this reason, fresh drinking milk was mostly consumed by children, the infirm, or immediately after milking. It was not a common beverage for adults in the way it is today, due to its perishability and the widespread use of ale or wine as safer drinks. The vast majority of milk was therefore processed into more stable, non-perishable forms. Cheese was paramount. Imagine large, rustic wheels of cheese, carefully aged in cool cellars, providing a concentrated source of protein and fat that could last for months. Cheese was a staple for all social classes. For a knight, cheese might accompany bread, be grated into pottages, or form part of a simple meal. Varieties would range from fresh, soft cheeses consumed quickly to hard, aged cheeses with more pronounced flavors. Imagine the distinct, earthy aroma of a cheese aging in a cool, damp stone room. Butter was another vital product derived from milk, especially important for cooking and adding fat to meals. Imagine the rhythmic churn of butter making, transforming cream into a rich, golden fat. Like cheese, butter was a calorie-dense food that could be preserved, though less effectively than hard cheese, especially in warmer months. It was often clarified or salted to extend its shelf life. For those in a knight's household, butter would have been a valuable commodity, used for cooking vegetables, enriching pottages, or spread on bread. Eggs, predominantly from chickens, but also from geese and ducks, were a constant source of protein throughout the year, especially on fast days. Imagine the familiar clucking of hens in the castle yard, providing a fresh supply daily. Eggs were highly versatile. They could be boiled, fried, scrambled, or incorporated into various dishes, including custards, tarts, and binding agents for sauces. Their availability, even during Lent, made them an indispensable part of the medieval diet. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of cracking fresh eggs, knowing they provided easy, quick nourishment. The dietary importance of dairy and eggs cannot be overstated, particularly for the common folk, but also for the knight, especially during those numerous religious fast days where meat was forbidden. These foods provided crucial nutrients and energy when other protein sources were off. They also offered a degree of dietary variety, breaking the monotony of grains and preserved meats. However, despite their nutritional value, the dairy products themselves, by modern standards, might have been considered quite bland or very strong depending on their aging. Cheeses were often unrefined, lacking the complex flavors of today's artisanal varieties. Butter might have been simply salted, and eggs, while fresh, would have been cooked with minimal seasoning beyond salt, and perhaps a few common herbs. There was little access to the wide range of flavorings and culinary techniques that would elevate these ingredients in later centuries. The storage and freshness of dairy products were constant challenges. Without refrigeration, dairy products had to be consumed quickly or processed into cheese and butter. This meant a continuous cycle of production and preservation, a quiet rhythm of daily chores in the medieval household. So, while the image of a knight rarely conjures visions of milkmaids or these dairy products and eggs were profoundly important. They were silent workhorses of the medieval diet, providing consistent nutrition, especially when meat was unavailable. They represent another facet of the surprisingly practical and often sustenance that fueled the lives of medieval knights, contributing to a daily diet that prioritized calories and basic nutrition over elaborate flavors. Having explored the fundamental building blocks of a medieval knight's diet, vegetables, meat, fish, dairy, and eggs, let us now turn to a topic that profoundly influenced the flavor of their food: spices and flavorings. Imagine a kitchen where the rich, complex aromas we take for granted were almost entirely absent, or reserved for the very highest echelons of society. The reality for most medieval knights was a diet where exotic seasonings were a rare luxury, contributing to an overall culinary experience that was, by our modern palates, surprisingly bland. The spices we casually sprinkle into our food today: black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, were incredibly valuable commodities in the Middle Ages. They traveled vast distances along perilous trade routes, like the Silk Road from Asia, or maritime routes from the East, through numerous intermediaries before reaching Europe. This arduous journey, coupled with high demand, meant that spices were astronomically expensive, often worth more than their weight in silver or even gold. Imagine the quiet awe and reverence with which a small pouch of imported peppercorns would have been handled. For the vast majority of medieval knights, especially those of modest means, daily access to these exotic spices was simply out of reach. Their household budgets would have been stretched thin, acquiring staple foods, maintaining armor, and supporting their retinue, while a powerful lord or a king might occasionally indulge in heavily spiced dishes to showcase their wealth and status. This was far from the norm for the average knight. So, how did a medieval knight's food taste without a cabinet full of spices? Their primary flavorings were simple, locally available, and often quite strong. Salt was paramount. It was not only a seasoning but an essential preservation agent for meat and fish. Imagine food that was often heavily salted, its taste dominated by a pervasive, while essential, too much salt could easily overpower other flavors. Vinegar was also commonly used, derived from soured wine or ale. It provided a sharp, acidic tang that could cut through the richness of fats or the heaviness of stews. Imagine the tartness of vinegar dressing a simple salad or added to a rich meat dish. Honey was the primary sweetener, as sugar was an incredibly expensive import until much later periods. Honey would be used in drinks, desserts, and even savory dishes to balance flavors. Imagine the gentle sweetness of honey offsetting the salt or tartness in a medieval meal. Local herbs played a more significant role than exotic spices for daily flavoring. Imagine herb gardens within the castle walls, carefully tended to provide fresh culinary additions. Common herbs included parsley, a fresh, green, somewhat peppery flavor; sage, earthy, slightly bitter, often paired with fatty meats; thyme, pungent, slightly floral, good for stews; rosemary piney, strong, often used with roasted meats. Mint, fresh, cooling, used in both savory and sweet dishes. Garlic and onions, though technically vegetables, these were indispensable for building flavor in almost every savory dish, providing a pungent, aromatic base. Imagine the subtle, earthy undertones these common herbs would add to a simmering pot. The culinary philosophy was often about layering these simpler, stronger local flavors, rather than building complex aromatic profiles with exotic spices. Long, slow cooking in a pottage or roasting over an open fire would draw out the natural flavors of the ingredients themselves. When exotic spices were used, even sparingly by a knight, their purpose was often to mask the taste of slightly spoiled food, especially preserved meats and fish, rather than to enhance fresh flavors. The strong, pungent aromas of spices could effectively cover up any of. Imagine the necessity of using strong seasonings to make long-stored salted fish more palatable. Furthermore, the idea of a truly balanced flavor profile, as we understand it with sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, was likely less refined for the average knight than for royal courts. Their palates were accustomed to more straightforward, robust, and often monochrome flavors. The subtlety of a delicate spice blend would have been largely unknown or unappreciated in daily meals. So, while the romantic image of medieval banquets conjures visions of heavily spiced dishes, the quiet reality for most medieval knights was a diet characterized by functional flavoring. Their meals were seasoned predominantly with salt, vinegar, honey, and readily available local herbs. Exotic spices were a rare indulgence, a fleeting touch of luxury that did not define their everyday culinary experience. This reliance on simpler, often bolder, local flavors contributed significantly to the surprisingly bland and consistent taste of their daily sustenance. From the subtle palette of medieval flavorings, let us now transition to another fundamental aspect of a medieval knight's daily life: their drinks. Imagine a world where the water from streams and wells was often unreliable, and where the primary beverages were brewed, fermented, or pressed. Ale, wine, and cider were not merely light. They were staples, crucial for hydration, and often safer alternatives to questionable water sources, playing a significant role in both sustenance and social life. The most common and pervasive drink for all social classes in medieval Europe, including knights, was ale. Imagine a hearty, often thick, brew, made from malted barley and water, sometimes flavored with hops or other herbs. Ale was typically low in alcohol content, making it safe for regular consumption throughout the day, even for children. The brewing process involved boiling the water, which purified it, making ale a much safer alternative to untreated water, which could be contaminated with bacteria and diseases. Imagine the comforting, slightly yeasty aroma of ale, a constant presence in medieval taverns and castle halls. Every household, including a knight's, would likely have brewed its own ale, or obtained it from a local brewer. Imagine the large brewing vats, the bubbling fermentation, and the satisfaction of having a constant supply of this vital beverage. Ale provided not just hydration, but also calories and some nutrients, making it a significant part of the daily diet. Wine was the beverage of choice for the nobility and wealthier classes, particularly in regions where grapes were cultivated, like France, Italy, and parts of Germany. Imagine a goblet of wine, perhaps a simple tabled wine, accompanying a knight's meal. While more alcoholic than ale, medieval wine was often less potent than modern varieties, and was frequently watered down for general consumption. Especially during the day, wine was a symbol of status and refinement, often served at feasts and special occasions. For knights in non-wine producing regions, imported wine would have been a costly luxury, reserved for special guests or celebrations. Cider, made from fermented apples, was common in regions where apple orchards flourished, such as parts of England and Normandy. Imagine the crisp, tangy taste of apple cider, a refreshing alternative to ale, especially popular in autumn after the apple harvest. Like ale and wine, the fermentation process made it a safer drink than raw water. And then there was water. While theoretically the most natural drink, pure, safe drinking water was a significant challenge in the Middle Ages. Rivers and wells could be easily contaminated by human and animal waste, leading to the spread of diseases like dysentery and cholera. Therefore, direct consumption of untreated water was generally avoided, especially in populated areas. Imagine the subtle risk involved in every sip of untreated water, driving the preference for brewed beverages. However, water was certainly used extensively for cooking, for washing and for diluting wine. For remote, well-maintained castles with deep wells or pure spring sources, fresh water might have been a safer option, but it was still often viewed with suspicion for direct drinking. The social significance of these drinks was considerable. Feasts and communal meals were often accompanied by copious amounts of ale or wine, fostering conviviality and social bonding. Imagine the clinking of tankards and goblets, the relaxed chatter, and the sense of community that shared drink provided. For the knight, offering good quality ale or wine to his guests and household was a mark of his hospitality and generosity. Herbal infusions, teas made from various medicinal or aromatic plants, were also consumed, though perhaps more for their perceived health benefits than its regular thirst quench. Imagine a warm, soothing, herbal infusion, perhaps to aid digestion. In times of scarcity, access to clean drinking water or brewed beverages could become a critical issue. Sieges, for instance, would often revolve around denying the besieged access to water or their ale supplies, highlighting the essential role these drinks played in daily survival. So, the surprisingly bland diet of a medieval knight was often washed down with an equally functional array of beverages. Ale was the steadfast companion, a safe and nourishing daily drink. Wine offered a touch of nobility and celebration, and cider provided regional variety. The prevalence of these brewed and fermented drinks, driven by the need for safe hydration, underscores the practicalities of medieval life and contributes to a comprehensive understanding of their daily sustenance. The quiet, consistent presence of these beverages was as fundamental to their survival as the food they ate, from the fundamental liquids that quenched their thirst. Let's now drift into the surprisingly practical world of medieval cooking methods in kitchen spaces. Imagine a castle kitchen, not with gleaming stainless steel and precise temperature controls, but with flickering firelight, the earthy scent of wood, and the constant hum of activity around large, simmering cauldrons. The methods used by medieval cooks for a knight's household were driven by necessity, efficiency, and the limitations of their technology, contributing to the often hearty but ultimately straightforward flavors of their meals. The heart of any medieval kitchen, whether in a grand castle or a more modest manor house, was the open hearth. Imagine a large, stone fireplace, often big enough for a person to stand inside, where massive logs burned continuously. This was the primary source of heat for all cooking. There were no modern stoves or ovens as we know them for daily use. Instead, various methods adapted to the open flame, boiling and stewing, were perhaps the most common cooking methods. Imagine a massive iron cauldron, hanging over the fire from a sturdy crane or chain, perpetually bubbling with pottage, as we've discussed, was the universal dish. A thick stew of grains, vegetables, and whatever meat scraps were available. This method was incredibly efficient, allowing for long, slow cooking that tenderized tough meats and vegetables, maximized nutrients, and allowed a single pot to feed many people. It also conserved fuel, as the same fire could keep a pot simmering for hours, or even days, with new ingredients added as needed. Imagine the comforting, slow gurgle of the pottage, a constant backdrop to kitchen life. Roasting was reserved for larger cuts of meat, often game or whole animals, especially for feasts or more prominent meals. Imagine a joint of venison or a whole fowl slowly rotating on a spit over the open flames, turned by a human spit boy or, in wealthier kitchens, by a dog turning a treadmill. This method produced delicious, smoky meat, but it required constant attention and was less efficient for daily cooking due to the heat loss and direct exposure to the flame. Imagine the sizzling fats dripping into a tray below, the rich aroma filling the hall, a true sign of a substantial meal. Baking, while it existed, was generally done in large bread ovens, which were separate from the main hearth. These were typically dome-shaped brick or stone ovens, heated by burning wood inside until the stones were scorching hot. The embers would then be raked out, and the bread or pies would be placed directly onto the hot floor of the oven to bake. Imagine the skill required to judge the temperature and timing without a thermometer. Smaller baked goods or individual pies might be cooked in covered pots placed directly into the embers of the hearth. Frying was also a known method, particularly for fish or smaller pieces of meat. Imagine a shallow pan, often made of iron, set directly over the embers or suspended over a lower flame. This required a good amount of cooking fat, which could be expensive, so was less common for everyday meals than boiling. The medieval kitchen itself was a bustling, often smoky, and somewhat chaotic space. Imagine large work tables made of rough-hewn wood, where ingredients were prepared, vegetables chopped, meat jointed, and dough needed. Utensils were robust and functional. Large knives, wooden spoons, iron ladles, and sturdy pottery or metal cooking vessels. There was no running water, so water had to be drawn from a well or carried from a nearby source. Imagine the constant movement of servants carrying buckets, emptying waste, and replenishing supplies. Hygiene, by modern standards, was rudimentary. While efforts were made to keep surfaces clean, the presence of open fires, animals, and limited sanitation meant that kitchens were breeding grounds for bacteria. Cooks relied on strong seasonings and thorough cooking to ensure food safety. For a knight living in a castle, the kitchen would have been a hive of activity, staffed by cooks, scullions, and other servants. The head cook held a position of considerable responsibility, managing supplies, preparing meals, and overseeing a busy team. Imagine the organized chaos, the distinct roles of each person, ensuring that the lord and his household were fed. The cooking methods, therefore, contributed directly to the blandness of the overall diet. Long boiling could leach out delicate flavors, and heavy salting for preservation often masked the natural taste of ingredients. While roasted meats could be flavorful, they were not a daily occurrence for most. The general lack of a wide variety of fresh herbs and spices, combined with simple cooking techniques, meant that the average night's meal, while hearty and filling, would have been consistent in its straightforward flavors, designed for sustenance rather than culinary exploration. From the practical realities of medieval kitchens, let us now gently transition to the more structured and often surprising world of dining etiquette and mealtime rituals for a medieval night. Imagine stepping into a bustling great hall, not a quiet dining room, where the clatter of trenchers and the murmur of voices filled the air, while seemingly less formal than later periods. Medieval dining had its own intricate set of rules, largely unspoken, that governed how a knight, and indeed everyone in his household, would approach their meals. These rituals were designed for order, hierarchy, and practicality, contributing to a mealtime experience that, though hearty, lacked the delicate refinements we associate with modern dining. For a night, meals, particularly dinner and supper, were communal affairs. They would typically be taken in the great hall of the castle or manor, a large, open space that served multiple purposes. Imagine long, trestle tables set up for meals, with the knight and his most esteemed guests seated at the high table on a raised dais, signifying their status. Below them, stretching down the hall, would be tables for lesser knights, squires, servants, and even some of the more favored tenants. This seating arrangement was a clear visual representation of the feudal hierarchy. Table manners, while different from ours, were important. There were no individual plates or forks for most diners. As we've discussed, trenchers of stale bread served as disposable plates. Food was typically served on large platters or in communal bowls, from which diners would take their share. Imagine reaching into a shared bowl of pottage with your spoon, or taking a piece of meat from a common platter with your hands. Forks, surprisingly, were very rare in medieval Europe, only slowly gaining acceptance in later centuries, often for eating specific foods like fruit or sweetmeats, and considered rather effeminate by some. The primary eating utensils were knives and spoons. Most food was eaten with the fingers. Imagine the practical necessity of washing hands before and after meals, often done with basins and ewer, provided by servants. Sharing was a key aspect of medieval dining. It was considered polite to share your trencher with a companion of equal or slightly lower status. Drinking vessels, like tankards of ale or goblets of wine, were also often shared, passed around among a small group. Imagine sipping from a communal cup, a gesture of camaraderie and trust. The serving of food was also hierarchical. The best cuts of meat and the choicest dishes would be presented first to the high table, before being distributed down the hall according to rank. Imagine the carving of a large roasted animal, its parts then carefully apportioned according to social standing. This ensured that the lord and his closest associates received the most desirable fare. The rhythm of the meal was often set by the arrival of dishes and the flow of conversation. There was no strict concept of courses as we know them. Instead, various dishes might be brought out and placed on the tables simultaneously, or in a somewhat overlapping sequence. Imagine a continuous stream of food appearing from the kitchen, keeping the tables replenished. Conversation during meals would have varied. At the high table, it might be more formal, discussing estate matters or news from afar. Further down the hall, conversation would likely be more boisterous and informal. However, certain topics might be avoided, and general politeness was expected. Entertainment during meals was also common, especially at feasts. This might include minstrels playing music, jesters performing tricks, or storytellers recounting tales. Imagine the sounds of a lute or a pipe accompanying the meal, adding to the atmosphere of the great hall. Waste was generally avoided. Any uneaten food, including the soaked trenchers, would be collected and often given to the poor or to the animals. This frugality was a practical necessity in a world where food scarcity was a constant concern. Religious rituals also influenced mealtimes. Before and after meals, grace would typically be said, reflecting the pervasive influence of the church on daily life. Imagine the quiet moment of prayer before a meal, a brief pause in the bustling activity. For a knight, dining was not just about eating, it was a social performance, a reaffirmation of his status and his relationship with his household and vassals. It was a daily ritual that reinforced the structure of medieval society in a very tangible way. While their food might have been surprisingly bland by our standards, the act of dining itself was rich with meaning and custom. This quiet adherence to protocol, even around the shared trencher, helps us understand the regulated nature of their daily sustenance. Having explored the social rituals of medieval dining, let's now consider one of the most critical and constant challenges faced by a medieval knight's household, and indeed, by everyone in the Middle Ages. Food preservation. Imagine a world utterly devoid of refrigeration, where every bite of food was a perishable commodity battling against spoilage, decay, and the relentless march of time. The methods they employed, though often rudimentary by modern standards, were ingenious adaptations to necessity, profoundly shaping the taste and texture of their surprisingly bland daily diets. The enemy of fresh food was clear: microbes, moisture, and warmth. Without cold storage, medieval people had to rely on a combination of techniques to extend the shelf life of their precious provisions, ensuring sustenance through long winters or during periods of scarcity. These methods were labor-intensive and often imparted very specific, strong flavors to the food, contributing to the overall character of their diet. Salting was, without a doubt, the most ubiquitous and vital preservation method, especially for meat and fish. Imagine large barrels or vats filled with layers of raw meat or fish, completely encased in coarse salt. The salt acted as a powerful dehydrating agent, drawing out moisture and creating an environment inhospitable to bacteria. After weeks or months in the salt, the meat would be removed, often incredibly hard and intensely salty. Imagine the laborious process of soaking these salted provisions, sometimes for days, with multiple changes of water, to leach out enough salt to make them palatable before cooking. While effective for preservation, this process significantly altered the food's flavor, often leaving it overwhelmingly briny and obscuring its original taste. Smoking was another common method, particularly for pork products like hams and bacon, but also for fish. Imagine a specially constructed smokehouse, or simply meat hanging in a chimney, exposed to cool, dense smoke from smoldering wood. The smoke contained compounds that inhibited bacterial growth, and the drying effect further preserved the food. Smoking also imparted a distinctive flavor that, while appealing to the medieval palate, was quite strong and uniform across smoked items. Imagine the woody, acrid aroma clinging to every piece of smoked meat. Drying, or desiccation, was crucial, especially for grains, legumes, fruits, and sometimes fish. Grains were dried in the sun or kilns to prevent mold and insect infestation. Dried peas and beans were stored in sacks, forming vital winter protein sources. Fruits like apples and pears could be sliced and providing a sweet, chewy snack during colder months. Imagine rows of fruit laid out too dry in the sun, or hanging from rafters in a well-ventilated storeroom. Fish, especially in northern climates, was often aired, which became incredibly tough and required pounding and lengthy soaking before it could be eaten. Pickling and fermenting were important for vegetables. Cabbage could be fermented into a form of sauerkraut. Other vegetables might be preserved in vinegar or broth. Imagine the tangy, sour taste of pickled vegetables, a sharp contrast to the often rich or salty main dishes. This provided both preservation and a welcome tartness to the diet. Sealing with fat was a method primarily used for meats, especially poultry or pork. After cooking, the meat would be submerged in rendered animal fat in a ceramic pot. The fat would solidify as it cooled, creating an airtight seal that prevented. Imagine a pot of rich, preserved meat waiting to be dug out and enjoyed months later. This method resulted in very rich, savory, and tender meat. Jellying was also used, often for cooked meats. The meat would be cooked in a highly gelatinous stock, which, upon cooling, would set into a firm jelly, encasing and preserving the meat from air exposure. Imagine cold, savory, jellied meats, a common component of medieval meals. The challenge of pest control was constant. Rats, mice, weevils, and other insects were a perpetual threat to stored provisions. Imagine the constant vigilance required to protect grain sacks and meat stores from these pervasive invaders. Cats were highly valued in medieval households for their pest control ability. These preservation techniques, while ingenious for their time, meant that a knight's diet, for much of the year, relied on foods whose flavors were profoundly altered from their fresh state. The overwhelming saltiness or dried characteristics often dominated the palate, leading to a culinary experience that, while hearty and calorie-dense, was surprisingly uniform and, by our standards, quite bland in its variety of fresh, distinct tastes. The quiet, persistent battle against spoilage profoundly shaped every meal. From the practicalities of food preservation, let us now gently turn our attention to the often unseen consequences of the medieval knight's diet, its impact on their health and susceptibility to disease. Imagine a time without modern nutritional science, where the subtle interplay of food scarcity, limited variety, and rudimentary hygiene led to a surprisingly common array of ailments, even among the noble and seemingly well. The knight, despite his privileged status, was far from immune to the dietary challenges of his age. One of the most pervasive issues stemming from the medieval diet was a range of nutritional deficiencies. While grains provided ample calories and carbohydrates, and meat offered protein, the lack of consistent access to a wide variety of fresh fruits and vegetables, particularly through the long winter months, meant that vitamins and minerals were often in short supply. Scurvy, caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, would have been a recurring problem, especially after winter when fresh produce was scarce. Imagine the subtle signs: bleeding gums, fatigue, aching joints, and weakened immune systems, quietly debilitating individuals who otherwise seemed robust. Oranges and lemons were exotic rarities, not dietary staples. Anemia, resulting from iron deficiency, could also be common, despite meat consumption. This might be due to parasitic infections, or simply inadequate absorption. Imagine a pervasive tiredness, a pallor that went unnoticed simply because it was so common. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, affected many, especially children, leading to weakened bones. While knights spent time outdoors, limited sunlight in winter months in northern climates, combined with perhaps restrictive indoor clothing, could contribute. The high consumption of coarse, unprocessed grains, while providing fiber, could also lead to dental problems. The stone-ground flour often contained small particles of grit and stone, which over time would wear down tooth enamel. Imagine the constant, subtle abrasion on their teeth with every bite of bread. This, combined with a lack of effective dental hygiene, led to common issues like tooth decay, abscesses, and gum disease, causing chronic pain and making chewing difficult. The heavy reliance on preserved foods, especially salted meats and fish, meant a diet very high in sodium. While necessary for survival, chronic high salt intake could contribute to issues like high blood pressure and kidney strain over a lifetime. Imagine the constant thirst, the subtle strain on the body from such a consistently salty diet. Foodborne illnesses were a constant threat. Without refrigeration, and with rudimentary understanding of bacteria, food spoilage was common. Meat and dairy could easily become contaminated, leading to bouts of vomiting, diarrhea, and more severe infections. Imagine the quiet, unpleasant reality of digestive upset being a regular occurrence, treated with folk remedies rather than modern medicine. The sourcing of water, often from questionable sources, also contributed to waterborne diseases. Despite their physical prowess, knights were not immune to obesity or gout, particularly those who indulged in more privileged diets. While their overall diet was less rich than we imagine, the relative abundance of meat, ale, and wine for the wealthy nobility, combined with less consistent, intense physical exertion outside of warfare and training, could lead to these conditions. Gout, often linked to high purine diets, would cause excruciating joint pain, quietly affecting a knight's ability to move or fight. Imagine the subtle stiffness in the joints, gradually worsening into debilitating pain, a silent companion to their rich diet. Furthermore, the general lack of dietary variety and the seasonal availability of fresh produce meant long periods of monotonous eating, which, while not a disease itself, could contribute to overall malaise and a reduced intake of diverse nutrients. Imagine the psychological effect of eating essentially the same few meals, week after week, month after month. The medieval medical understanding of diet was rudimentary. They believed in the concept of humors, and that food could affect their balance, while they understood that certain foods were hot or cold. Their specific knowledge of vitamins, minerals, or the true causes of many deficiencies was non-existent. Remedies for ailments were often herbal, purgatives, or bloodletting, rather than specific dietary interventions. So, the surprisingly bland and often repetitive diets of medieval knights, born from the practicalities of their era, carried with them a silent array of health challenges. Nutritional deficiencies, dental problems, and vulnerability to foodborne illnesses were common companions. Even for the privileged, their physical strength and resilience were constantly tested, not just by warfare and training, but by the very food that sustained them, a quiet testament to the enduring struggles of life in the Middle Ages. Finally, let us consider how the medieval knight's diet, already shaped by daily realities and social structure, underwent a significant and often challenging transformation when they were on campaign or engaged in warfare. Imagine the shift from the relatively predictable, if bland, meals of a castle hall to the harsh, uncertain provisions of the battlefield, where sustenance was dictated by logistics, necessity, and often scarcity. This shift reveals the ultimate pragmatism of their diet, where survival superseded all other considerations. Life on campaign was fundamentally different from life within the comfortable walls of a castle. A knight, leading his retinue, would be constantly on the move, facing unpredictable weather, harsh terrain, and the constant threat of enemy engagement. This mobile existence made traditional cooking and the regular supply of fresh food incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Imagine the logistical nightmare of feeding hundreds, or even thousands, of men and their horses in the field. The staple of the campaigning knight's diet remained grain, but often in its most portable and resilient forms. Hardtack, a type of hard, dry biscuit made from flour and water, was ubiquitous. Imagine biting into a piece of hardtack, incredibly dense and tough, designed to last 4 months without spoiling. It was monotonous, difficult to chew, and often needed to be soaked in water or ale to become edible. But it provided essential calories. Grains like oats might also be carried in sacks and cooked into simple porridges over campfires when possible. Preserved meats and fish were crucial. Salted pork and beef, or dried and salted fish like stockfish, formed the bulk of the protein supply. Imagine the challenge of making these provisions palatable without the luxury of lengthy soaking times. They would be boiled in makeshift campfires, often creating heavily salted stews that served as both food and a means of rehydration. The taste, by modern standards, would have been overwhelmingly briny and monotonous, but it offered vital calories for the arduous demands of travel and combat. Foraging and requisitioning became vital supplementary methods. When marching through enemy territory, or even friendly lands, armies would often live off the land. This meant requisitioning food from local villages and farms. Imagine the desperate farmers watching their livestock and crops being taken by passing armies, a grim reality of medieval warfare. This could provide fresh meat, vegetables, and grain, but it was unreliable and depended entirely on the productivity and population density of the traversed region. Hunting would also have played a role for knights and their squires, providing fresh game when conditions allowed. Imagine small hunting parties venturing out from the main column, seeking deer, rabbits, or birds to supplement the meager rations. However, this was opportunistic and could not sustain a large force. Water supply was a constant concern and a strategic objective. Armies would always try to encamp near reliable sources of fresh water, such as rivers or wells. Imagine the careful planning around water points and the desperate thirst that would afflict soldiers when sources were scarce or contaminated. Ale, carried in barrels, also served as a safer, more hydrating alternative to suspect water. The concept of a balanced meal was entirely abandoned on campaign. The focus was solely on calories and sustenance. Food was fuel for fighting and marching. Flavor, variety, and culinary pleasure were distant luxuries. Imagine the quiet, grim determination to simply consume enough to keep going, even if the food was repetitive and dietary health on campaign inevitably suffered. Long marshes, poor sanitation, and reliance on preserved, often nutrient-deficient foods led to widespread illness. Dysentery, scurvy, and general malnutrition were common scourges of medieval armies, often claiming more lives than actual combat. Imagine the quiet suffering in the camp, the constant threat of illness, debilitating even the strongest knight. The ability to maintain a food supply also dictated the length and success of campaigns. A well-supplied army could sustain a siege or a long march, while a poorly provisioned force would quickly succumb to hunger and disease, forcing a retreat. Imagine the commanders poring over maps, not just for tactical advantage, but for reliable sources of provisions. So, the diet of a medieval knight on campaign was a stark departure from even the relatively bland routine of castle life. It was a testament to survival, relying on hardy, portable, and often heavily preserved provisions. The emphasis was purely on calorie intake to sustain the immense physical demands of warfare, often at the expense of taste, variety, and long-term health. It's a quiet reminder that behind the clang of armor and the glory of battle, the daily reality of medieval knighthood was often a surprisingly simple, functional, and undeniably bland meal, designed solely to keep the fight alive.